Hi, welcome to YTV and this week's segment of Everybody Has a Story. Patrick Murck is a founding member and the executive director of the Bitcoin Foundation. He has been brought to campus today by the Yale Politic magazine, and he joins us here for the show. Patrick, thanks so much for being here.
Great, thank you for having me.
So, I was online yesterday searching about Bitcoin, and one of the first things that came up on YouTube was a TED Talk, and the title of it was, "What the Bleep is Bitcoin?" I think it encapsulated what a lot of people think when they see this word. So, what the bleep is Bitcoin?
Sure. So there's no simple answer to that question, just like there's no simple answer to what is the internet exactly, right? We don't really think about, well, oh, it's a series of, protocols and ways to exchange information across connected computers. And that's how most people describe Bitcoin. They say, oh, well, there are these computers, there are these miners, there's all this stuff that happens. When you kind of abstract all that away, what Bitcoin really is it's a way for me to have transactions occur electronically, instantly, over the internet, without having to trust any third parties to make sure that it clears and settles. So I can send money, a deed to a house, contract conditions, digital rights. I can send it across the internet, and I never have to trust a third party to make sure that that transaction is valid and that it cleared and settled to the next party.
Sure, but how can you trust the party that you're dealing with?
Well, you don't necessarily trust the party that you're dealing with, right? Unless you have some other information that makes you want to trust the party that you're dealing with. Bitcoin and the Bitcoin protocol and the blockchain, they don't handle that part of it, right? The only thing that the Bitcoin network does is remove trust from middlemen, right? The financial intermediaries, the fiduciary trust centers. Right? When it comes to whether I want to engage in a peer-to-peer commerce with you, I'm going to have to do my own diligence, or maybe use a different protocol layer or a different system to make sure that I know who I'm dealing with.
Well, sure. So this leads me, I guess, to the next thing I want to talk about here, which is centralized control. There's no federal reserve of Bitcoins here. There's no governing authority. Does there need to be some sort of regulation for this to be sustainable?
So there does need to be some regulation, but not the type that we're used to, right? And the regulation is essentially how the system is set up, how it's governed by the code and the participants on the network. So if you want to make a change to Bitcoin, say you think 21 million Bitcoin aren't enough, right? We want to double the amount of Bitcoin out there for whatever reason. You could issue a change to the code if you wanted to, a proposed change. You'd have to gain consensus from the people who develop the software that this is the right thing to do, and then you'd have to do the actual work of coding and programming it, and you'd submit that. If you gain consensus from the software development community that's working on the open source project, they would issue an update to what's called Bitcoin Core, which is the reference implementation of the Bitcoin protocol. Then you'd have to convince all the miners, the people who are processing the transactions, to upgrade their software. And then you'd have to convince all the consumers who are using the client wallet software to upgrade their software too. So there's a lot of checks and balances, and what it leads to is a very, very simple protocol and a conservative approach.
Sure. Well, President Obama was recently in California for a cybersecurity summit, and this brings to mind the central question a lot of people have with Bitcoin, which is how safe is this? I mean, we've seen in recent years, especially with Mt. Gox, the $460 million theft there. If Bitcoins get stolen, there seems to be no accountability to get them back.
Yeah, there's nobody to seek redress. You can't say, stop stealing my Bitcoin, give them back to me, right? I could say that, but there's nobody who could enforce that on you, right? And we have to keep in mind that's why you want to do your diligence when you have a peer-to-peer transaction. But it's especially when you want to do your diligence if somebody's creating a service that reinserts trust back into the network, right? So if I want to start a Bitcoin exchange and I say, I promise I'll hold your Bitcoin safe, there's no reason for you to necessarily trust me unless I have some other things in place, like insurance and some security upgrades like multi-sig wallets and things like that. And then maybe I'd be willing to trust somebody else with my Bitcoin. But the actual network itself and the Bitcoin software, that's never been hacked. And it's a giant honeypot, so I'm sure if it could be, it would have been by now.
Sure. Do you think that, how would you make the case to people who say that, this is certainly a fascinating project, but right now it's being used more for ill than for good. We've seen the Silk Road, black markets with illegal drugs and hired assassins. Some crazy stories that have come out of this, and there's been talk about this being used by terrorist networks to be less trackable by governments like the United States. What would you say to people who say, like, this is bad, this is unregulated currency that is falling into the wrong hands?
Right. So it's an interesting question because Bitcoin is an experiment, right? The Bitcoin protocol is an experiment, and people are experimenting with it. Good people are experimenting with it, and bad people are experimenting with it. I think what we found is that the bad people who are experimenting with Bitcoin, who think it's anonymous, right, are finding out that it's really not as anonymous as they might have thought. Usually the best analogy is Bitcoin is about as anonymous as surfing the internet. And do you feel like you're anonymous when you surf the internet?
No, not anymore.
Not at all. Yeah, exactly. And I think about the same subset of people who can claim some level of anonymity surfing the internet could probably attain some level of temporary anonymity using Bitcoin. But the bad actors who have tried to use Bitcoin, they seem to be failing in their experiments because they're getting caught and their transactions are getting tracked. And anybody who's kind of in that web of transactions is now starting to get swept up into it. And you start to wonder, maybe the Bitcoin for bad things experiment is failing, and that's a good thing for the rest of us.
Well, sure, but even with those stories, they've certainly affected the perception of Bitcoin in the media, of this peer-to-peer cryptocurrency. Bitcoin, its value was at $1,000 back in 2013. It's now down to, I think, around 200. Was this a bubble that people were interested in for a little while, and then it kind of passed out of fashion?
So that was a bubble, and it wasn't the first bubble in Bitcoin, and it probably won't be the last bubble in Bitcoin. We're dealing with experimental technology. I think the best way to think about the price of Bitcoin, and trust me, I'm sensitive. I get paid my full salary in Bitcoin, so I'm very, very sensitive to the price of Bitcoin. Sometimes it feels like I'm getting paid in pork belly contracts or something, right? But the best way is, if you've ever worked in a startup, you get startup equity. And startup equity goes up and down, and it's this crazy roller coaster ride as you're working through the startup. The difference is there's not a daily ticker that shows like this is the value of your company every step along the way. Bitcoin is kind of like the first totally distributed company where everybody has some Bitcoin as sort of part of the company. They have some shares in it. But you get to watch the ticker price go up and down every single day. So it definitely, if you're, again, it's high risk, it's an experiment. If you're a consumer and you don't know how to trade these exotic financial instruments, then you should not be buying Bitcoin for speculative purposes.
Let's talk internationally. What kind of role do you think Bitcoin can have in countries that are experiencing financial distress, whether it's hyperinflation? You've seen problems recently in Russia. Some countries in Africa have experienced this hyperinflation. What kind of role can Bitcoin have there?
Yeah, so it's not just Bitcoin either. It's really Bitcoin, but all the digital currencies. What you're seeing develop is a new global financial institution, really, right? These online electronic transaction ledgers, right, that operate outside of they're apolitical, outside of the control of any single government. And the implications of that are any government and central bank that wants to institute capital controls to stabilize their own economy or for whatever reasons they want to do it, they're not really going to be able to effectively do that. And it's going to be less and less as we go forward. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just a thing, and it's real. So when you think of Bitcoin, and you think about it in terms of capital controls and monetary policy, Bitcoin is like the hottest of hot money. It's capital that can move instantly around the world, in and out of any country. And I think we all just have to learn to deal with that a little bit.
Let's talk about the direction it's going in. The Winklevoss twins, who are best known for their affiliation with Facebook for suing Mark Zuckerberg for $65 million. They have bet big on Bitcoin. They started this exchange last month called Gemini, which is the Latin word for twins.
Yeah, who would have figured?
There you go, well done, Winklevoss twins. But they started this exchange, and they've invested, I think, $11 million of their own money in this. But this is regulated. they're trying to make it so your Bitcoin, can have FDIC insurance. Is this the right direction?
There's certainly that's certainly a right direction. There's no single right direction, but integrating into the traditional financial system is important. It's important for the Bitcoin ecosystem. It's important for regulators. It's important for all of us to see that integration happens as smoothly as possible. Because if you want to combat the bad uses of Bitcoin, you need to establish trust in those critical control points, the exchanges. So if you're going to give me your Bitcoin and I'm going to store them for you, if I inject trust back into the system, inherently regulation is going to follow. It's going to follow me. And I'm going to have some obligations, not just under the Bank Secrecy Act, but other obligations, to make sure that I'm building a responsible system and that you're not abusing it. And I think that's good for everybody.
And lastly, what are you doing at the Bitcoin Foundation to help promote this project?
I'm sitting here talking to you right now, as a matter of fact. But in addition, we have a series of conferences that we're developing called DevCore to get more software engineers, software developers involved in the Bitcoin Core software project. We have launched a public awareness campaign with some of the biggest companies in the ecosystem as well to help create a positive message for Bitcoin.
Patrick Murck, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
And as always, thank you for joining us for YTV. I'm Cody Pomerantz, and this has been Everybody Has a Story. Get your Bitcoin. We'll see you next time.